If you've ever heard of the history of corsets, you've probably heard the story that in the 1920s, when women were liberated, they also were liberated from the corset. Well, the truth is that the 1930s body is still very much created by the corset. It just is called the girdle instead of a corset. But the basic principle of the garment is exactly the same. Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making a 1930s body. Because the thing is that throughout history, bodies were made. You know, the body that you actually present to the world, that was artificially made. It was meant to be artificially made, and it was not supposed to be your private body, the body you have underneath your clothes. It was supposed to be whatever shape was fashionable. And that had nothing to do with body size. It was purely about how the flesh is distributed, how it looks and presents to the outside world. And that can be achieved by corsetry and padding and by different sort of shapewear, no matter what body size you are. The fashionable body shape of the 1930s was straight, fairly slim, with soft curves and very smooth lines. So the best way to achieve that, if you're not 17, is simply to use corsetry. And because stockings were still held up by garters, so you had, your options basically were a garter belt, which has the lace structure. It does provide some smoothing, especially on the abdomen, but it does easily create a rough ridge where it ends if you are a bit more fleshy around the stomach area. But that is your lightest option. Then your next option is a girdle, which provides some support. It can provide a lot of support or very light support depending on the size of the girdle and also the materials used. They could be made out of completely elasticated fabrics, or they could be made with elasticated panels and then woven fabrics, or they could be made almost entirely of woven fabrics. They could have busks in them, and they still could have the eyelets for lacing and tightening like a regular corset of the earlier eras. But these were kind of going away. They are less common in the 1930s, though you do still see them. More commonly, you see different sorts of hooks and eyes, and then just busks with elastic to help you actually be able to close them. Girdles could either come up to your waist or slightly above it, or all the way up to your underbust, depending on the shape and the amount of structure you want from the garment. The main idea is to create those smooth curves and a straight front. So you would typically have more boning in the front to help smooth out that front. And girdles were sold for various different body types and different shapes. So there were girdles that were meant to provide more hold on the lower abdomen if that was an area where you naturally have more of a bulge. And there's also ones that are meant to slim down the hips so that especially that upper hip area is more slimmer and smoother and smaller looking, depending on what your natural body looks like and where you needed really help. Typically, a girdle would be bought 2 centimeters or a little under an inch smaller than your natural waist measurement. So basically, the idea is that most girdles don't actually reduce your waist much, but they can. They can, especially if you are more apple-shaped naturally, then you would definitely have a more corset-like, more structured garment that would slim down and create those curves.
And remember, when I'm talking about slimmer or straighter body, I don't mean the actual size of the body, I mean the shape of the body, the silhouette of the body.
Because it's all about illusion. Corsetry can't actually reduce anything, it just moves flesh around. So there has to be a place where that flesh goes. And a lot of time with 1930s girdles, because we're slimming down often the upper hip and the lower stomach area. So unlike in a lot of Victorian corsets where you slim down the waist and then the excess flesh, the flesh that we're moving, not excess as in excess to your body, but as in the stuff that we're moving around, that often gets put down to your lower abdomen area. But because these girdles work differently, because that is to smooth out that lower abdomen, so what happens is that flesh that gets moved around usually gets pushed up. And the reason why you would buy a girdle 2 centimeters or an inch smaller than your natural waist is simply because if we don't reduce the waist at all, oftentimes what happens is, especially in a girdle, because it doesn't go very high up on your body, so if we are at your natural waist and it doesn't change at all the measurement there, what happens when you sit around and bend down to get something, what it will do is it will creep up if there is room for it to creep up. And then what will happen is that it will actually put pressure on your lower rib cage, and that will be uncomfortable. So that's really the real reason why any corsetry or girdles usually are bought a little bit smaller than your actual waist, even if you're not actually planning to reduce anything with it. It's simply because that way it will stay where it's supposed to be and be much more comfortable. And then your third option for foundation wear would be a corselette. This would be the most rigid, the most structured, and the most heavy duty of the different kinds of foundation garments usually seen in the 1930s. And like the name suggests, this is most reminiscent of the typical Victorian era corset, because this garment usually has a built-in bra or brassiere area to it, and it would provide those smooth lines all the way down. So especially if you are naturally a little bit softer, and this is again not about body size, it is about how soft the actual flesh is. On most people, it is either on the softer side or the firmer side. And this, again, like I said, has nothing to do with body size. You can be very small and still have softer body tissue, or you can be much bigger and still have much firmer body tissue. So on somebody with the softer body tissue, you easily get lumps and bumps where the different foundation garments end. And you can see this nowadays in a lot of women with bras, especially at the back. For a lot of us, that softer tissue gets pressed down by the band of the bra, and that creates lumps and bumps. So to avoid this in the 1930s, they would wear a corselette. So basically, you want to choose whatever foundation garment fits your lifestyle or the situation you're wearing it, and also your body type. So more typically, the people with the softer body tissue, more fleshiness in especially the abdomen area, they would more typically wear stronger girdles and corselettes, and people who are naturally very slim, especially in the stomach area, would more typically wear the softer undergarments and just maybe wear a garter belt. Well, the general shape created by the girdles pretty much stays the same throughout the 1930s. There is a change that happens during the 1930s in the silhouette, and that happens in the bust area. In the beginning of the 1930s, the bust is a lot more rounded, much closer to the 1920s bust. It is not as flat as the 1920s bust, but it is definitely a softer, more rounded shape. And during the mid-century, that shifts, and the more pointy, definitely not a bullet bra, but like a lot more pointy, a lot more natural silhouette becomes fashionable. But because this is a transitional era, you do see a lot of variation, and there's also a lot of like personal preference things going on. But you want to keep that in mind, that usually earlier in the 1930s, the silhouette is softer, more rounded, and by the end of the 30s, you get a lot more pointy and a lot higher bust line than in the earlier part of the era. So that's another reason why a girdle is maybe more practical for a modern costumer than a corselette, because it's just switching the bra out, you can make this work for multiple time periods. The biggest shift that happens from the corset 1930s girdle is really actually not in the way the garment is structured itself, because elastics have been used in corsetry from at least the 19 teens onward, and they were very common in the 19 teens. Most corsets, in fact, did have some sort of elastication in them by the end of 19 teens. But the thing is that there's a huge shift that happens in the end of the 1920s and early 1930s is in how we view hygiene, and especially hygiene related to corsetry. Because previously, always, the corset has come above some sort of foundation garment. You always have something next to your skin that doesn't keeps your corset from touching bare skin, in the form of a shift or combination underwear or chemise, but there's always something there. In the 1930s, you start seeing corsetry and especially garter belts against bare skin for the first time. But this is by no means happening to every single girdle and corselette in this era. It is a slow, gradual shift and change. And there are definitely a lot of women who are still wearing their underwear, something underneath their corset or girdle, because it is a lot more comfortable that way. And I am definitely going to be doing that. So yes, they still did have slip-in teddies or step-in teddies that they basically was the combination underwear of that era, and those would often button at the crotch so that you can still use the restroom without having to take your girdle off.
This is the pattern that I'll be using for my girdle.
The pattern was originally first published in 1930 in De Gracias, and it is kindly provided by Klosterfrock on her webpage. I will link it down below. It originally had a rubberized, so that means elasticated panel in the front to hold back the stomach more and provide more support. I personally kind of hate any sort of rubberized, elasticated bits on my corsetry. I know some people find the elasticated or rubberized bits to provide more comfort. I personally do not. I feel that they are much less comfortable. They remind me a lot more of Spanx when they're on. I feel like an overstuffed potato wearing them. It's uncomfortable. I just hate them. So that's why I leave them out as much as possible.
I started by printing out the pattern in its original size and then changed the proportions to better match my body. So in my case, that meant taking in the waist a little bit and adding some hip flare, making sure that the lines stay gradual and don't become exaggerated, more like in the Edwardian era. This pattern doesn't come with seam allowance, and I like to draw out my seam allowance straight onto my fabric. The front piece is cut on the fold, and I cut out 2 of them, as well as 2 of the other pieces. The side and back pieces get sewn together with felt seams. Then I add cotton tape boning channels to the center of the panels. I place the 2 front panels on top of each other with wrong sides facing each other and the back side of the panel facing me, and then I mark the boning channels onto that. I make a larger channel at the center front for the 10mm spring steel boning, and then narrower ones for the sides. Then I sew the right side of that center front panel onto the rest of the corset. And the left side piece's seam allowance is folded in twice and stitched in place. And on the left side of the front piece, the seam allowances get sandwiched onto the inside and pinned together and sewn in place. And then hook and eye tape gets sewn onto the left side's front and side pieces, and boning inserted into the channels. I use a mix of spiral steel and zip ties. And then I add the elastic to the bottom of the center front panel, and again fold the seam allowances towards each other and stitch in place. And lastly, I trim the edges with bias binding. And here's the finished girdle with the early 1930s style step-in teddy and stockings and a Kestos bra. This provides a good amount of back support and gives those smooth 1930s lines. And the low back neckline allows them to be worn with the low-backed evening and summer styles of the 1930s. And of course, before I can put the actual dress on, I would wear a slip. That helps keep the dress from clinging onto your legs as you walk and also further smooths out the lines. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope to see you again next time. So please hit that like button and follow me if you haven't already. Bye.
You've probably heard the story. The fashionable body sleeve, fairly columnar, blah, 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 columnar.